Greetings all. My name is Joy McAtee and I'm the project manager of Lean Into Louisville, and I'm so honored that you all have elected to join us for this important discussion. It's my hope that all who are gathered this evening, whether in person or virtually, will leave with a fuller understanding of redistricting. Lean Into Louisville is focused on addressing and confronting the history and legacy of all forms of racism and discrimination through a series of presentations, art exhibits, activities, and conversations like the one we're hosting tonight. It's imperative that we are connecting with individuals who are typically absent from these kinds of discussions to educate, unify, and then empower them to participate in civic engagement and advocacy to affect policy change that uplifts all people. We certainly want guests and viewers engaging with us this evening. So for those watching online, the easiest way to submit questions to the panel will be through the comment section. And for those in the gallery, we will provide you with a note card and pen that will be collected and handed to the moderator. And without further ado, I would like you to please welcome Mayor Greg Fischer, who will share a few words and then introduce our moderator for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you for the great work you're doing with Lean Into Louisville. And thank you to the audience members and those watching from home joining us this evening. Tonight, our excellent panel is going to be taking a closer look at redistricting electoral boundaries, something that's kind of mystical to most people, so we're going to try to make it real here tonight. And this is just one of the many events during our week-long 2022 Juneteenth celebration. I'd like to thank our chair, Wanda Mitchell-Smith, over here for all the hard work she's doing pulling together Juneteenth, and encourage everybody to enjoy the events. Our Juneteenth celebration ranges from opportunities to highlight black-owned businesses, encourage black entrepreneurship and wealth building, to showcase the arts, health, and wellness, along with meaningful discussions about race, equity, and inclusion. So we encourage all Louisvillians to participate in all of our activities that highlight the historical importance of Juneteenth. Observed every year on June 19th, the holiday originated in Galveston, Texas in 1865, when soldiers gave residents notice of the end of slavery, nearly 2 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So these folks were kept enslaved for 2 years after they needed to be. It was called Freedom Day. But even as we honor that significant moment in our nation's history, we must also acknowledge that true freedom, the ability to achieve one's full human potential, is still not a given for too many people, especially black Americans and too many black Louisvillians. And while our country was built on the principles of freedom and equality, those values are not real or meaningful in the lives of all Americans. As mayor, I have been committed to improving racial equity in Louisville. I created the Office of Equity to make sure that Louisville Metro government policies and practices, from hiring and promotions to procurement procedures, align with that commitment. We created Lean Into Louisville after the activities in Charlottesville, Virginia several years ago, to teach people about the roots of hate and the roots of discrimination, believing that if they have more knowledge, they will become more open-minded and see us all as interdependent and essential to each other. And soon we're going to be announcing plans for a new initiative called Truth and Transformation in our community. I want to thank Lean Into Louisville Project Manager Joy McAtee, Michael Meeks, our Director of Equity for the City of Louisville, for putting together a diverse lineup of panelists who will discuss redistricting this evening. So we invite the audience and those watching on our Facebook stream to listen and reflect on what redistricting is, who it helps and who it hurts, and understand the short-term and long-term implication for our city's residents. And now it's my honor to introduce our moderator for this evening, University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law grad Dolores D. Pregliasco is a former teacher and adjunct professor at U of L undergraduate and law schools. Among her many accolades, she's a retired attorney from private practice, but she's hardly retired. She's a practicing mediator, former assistant Commonwealth's attorney, county attorney, and district judge. Dee is on the board of the Legal Aid Society, vice president and redistricting chair of the League of Women Voters of Kentucky, and former president and board member of the Louisville League of Women Voters. Dee, we really appreciate you dedicating such a big part of your life to making sure everybody has the opportunity to vote and vote fairly. So everybody, please welcome Dee Pregliasco.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce our panel in a few moments, but I want to give a little background because sometimes when you say redistricting, people their eyes kind of glaze over, or, or like my granddaughter, their eyes kind of roll back in their head. Redistricting, what is that? If you say gerrymandering, people go, ooh, I know about that, but they don't necessarily connect the two. And so one of the things that we're going to do tonight is sort of talk about that and how all of that affects us locally and even in our state. But I wanted to give just a little background because part of what the League does, and this is what I'm so committed to, and I'd like for you to know we're nonpartisan. We don't support parties and we don't support candidates, but we do support policies. And to have good redistricting and not bad redistricting, which is what gerrymandering is, we are committed to that. So keep in mind that every 10 years, the census occurs. And lots of things happen because of that census, but one of the things that happens, and this is part of our Constitution, having this census every 10 years, means that the numbers of people, notice I didn't say citizens, the numbers of people that are living in all the different localities, which of course includes the states, are counted so that lots of things can happen, not the least of which the federal government gives money back to the states for activities and services for people. But it also sets up districts based upon population numbers. So for example, even though they didn't think that slaves were people, the South was able to come up with, as part of the compromise in the Constitution, was 3/5 compromise, that slaves were counted as 3/5 of people. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, that gave the South, the southern states, the slave states, much more power, which unfortunately they kept over the years because what happened is even after African Americans received freedom from slavery, women were not able to vote. Black men were given the right to vote, but not black women. And then, of course, what we know is they wanted those people to be counted for purposes of the states to have representation. But, of course, through their Jim Crow laws, first the black codes and then the Jim Crow laws, then they kept them from voting. So, again, the South was able to keep the power that they had originally because of the way that they treated people who were the other, people not like them, African Americans, and then we know it affected people from Asia. And of course, we know those are still huge issues today. So what happens with the census is the numbers are counted, and that tells us how many state legislators, congressmen we have from our state that go to Congress. If you might remember, some of us are old enough, we remember when Kentucky had 7 congressmen. Remember that? Okay, now we only have 6 because we lost population. We are excited that Louisville gained about 40,000. I think that's the number, 41,000, so that's helpful. But that population counting affects how the districts are drawn, and that affects the state. We have some state representatives and a state senator here. It affects how all of that happens, as well as it affects, obviously, Metro and Metro Council. And so how are those lines drawn? And so you're going to hear about that, I'm sure, from some of these folks, because obviously Metro Council person Piagentini, we have to practice how we say our names, Pregliasco and that. And then obviously Metro Council President David James will talk about it from the Metro Council point of view. But keep this in mind, and this is where the census is so important, because what happened for the state of Kentucky also happened in Louisville. In the state of Kentucky, people in the west moved east, people in the east moved west, and what you have is this population changes on the I-65 corridor, the I-75 corridor, connected by the I-64 corridor, and then we have 71 that went up to northern Kentucky. So northern Kentucky gained population, and then some, not all, but some of the counties along all those corridors gained in population. Bullitt County grew, okay, Shelby County, Nelson County, Bardstown, they've all grown, plus northern Kentucky. In Metro Council in Louisville, people moved east, and that affected all of these districts. So What does all this mean for the league? And I think for us, what it should mean is these are voting issues. This is all about voting. So it's not just redistricting in a vacuum, but it's about voting and who you elect to represent you wherever it is you might live and for whatever office. What I've come to say are two things. One, what happens in Frankfurt does not stay in Frankfurt, because what they do there affects all of us. What happens in Metro Council, okay, doesn't stay there. It affects all of us who live in the metro area in Jefferson County. So these are really, really critical issues. All right, let me just tell you a little bit, because you probably know all of these people. They're very prominent. They've got lots of things that we can talk about with them, but I'll just start at the beginning. I've already mentioned Metro Council President David James, okay? Been around for a while. I think you're on your 5th term. And he has a background, obviously, with LMPD. He was a U.S. Army intelligence specialist. He's been a majority leader, Metro Council President Pro Tem of the Metro Council, and chair of the Democratic Caucus. Obviously, he's going to have a lot to say, I know, about redistricting. No? Okay. Well, he actually had a committee, we actually did a presentation about redistricting for Metro Council. The league did. We have here, obviously, we had to have somebody who brought some color here to this, for sure. Colonel Pamela Stevenson, and she's the state representative for District 43, and she's served in the legislature since 2021. And she's someone after my heart because my son's in the Army. She's a retired veteran, and so we appreciate that. She's adjunct professor, mother, West End native, and in all kinds of government committees, and we appreciate that. Representative Kevin Bratcher, who I've worked with on redistricting. In fact, we attended a conference on redistricting in Ohio, I think in 2019, together. He represents District 29. He was the first Republican House Majority Whip in Kentucky history. He's the chair of the Elections, Constitutional Amendments, and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, and vice chair of the Small Business and Information and Technology Committee, and he's a veteran. And I've testified before his committee in Frankfurt. Then we have Anthony Piagentini. He was elected in 2018. I hope I have that right, as councilman for Metro District 19. He's a businessman with 20 years of service in the private sector. He's worked for several businesses. He's currently a commercial real estate advisor. And he studied Mandarin Chinese for a year in Taiwan. Wow. Okay, that's certainly impressive, to say the least, okay? He is a veteran also, as I mentioned, of the United States Marine Corps, and he's chairman of the Minority Caucus. And then we have the ultimate Senator Neal, who's been around a while. I've known him for a long time. He's a member of, obviously, the Democratic Party caucus and represents District 33 since 1988. He's a senior fellow of public policy and adjunct professor at U of L. He's taught, teaches, he knows everything there is to know, I think, about local government and state government. And he's the founder of the Kentucky African American All Children's Caucus. So what I'm going to do, and I'll just start here and we'll go down, give us your view of how we can educate the public and educate voters about redistricting, and then what is your view about this? And let me say this as a sort of a final background, and we'll go through each of you, and then we've got a lot of questions. In 2020, in 2021, and 2022, the League proposed that there be a law passed that would set up an advisory commission for the state for redistricting. Those proposed bills got nowhere. We also asked for a joint resolution because what we were pushing for is an open process. That is, the public would be involved. To make sure everybody's clear, though, under our Constitution, the Constitution allows the legislature to make those decisions about Congress and about state representatives and for state senators. And at some point, I'm going to point out, I've put up a map, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That has to do with the congressional districts. And then Metro Council appointed a committee, and I presume that came in, and Metro Council President James can talk about that. there was a committee, they worked on redistricting. They did have, asked for comments. They got comments, they drew maps, again, population issues. And then they asked for comments again, and I think you probably know, I wound up talking with people because a lot of neighborhood associations were upset, and I talked with them in the sense of what they needed to talk to the committee about if they didn't like the way the lines were drawn, and they were just draft lines. Representative Bratcher knows that the league wanted there to be that open kind of process because there was no input from the public. There's only input from legislators, and so they can talk, each of them can talk about this. But Representative Stevenson, why don't you start about redistricting and what you want to say?
Here's where we fall short. There's not a connection between the importance of the census and the resulting redistricting. So a lot of people perhaps didn't answer their door, didn't fill out the census form, and then it was exasperated when they cut funding to do the census. So I'm not sure if those numbers are accurate, but they're the numbers we've got. And those are the numbers that determine how much money we get, how many people should be in each district. When you come to the end and you look at the map, it's almost too late at that point, especially when it's not a public procedure. Number two, this democracy works because people believe that it works. And anytime you do anything to jeopardize that faith in the system, like have closet redistricting, not having input from the people that it impacts, and not doing for people as people would expect you would do for them. In other words, whenever politics gets involved, we do a disservice not only to the people of this great state, but to democracy and this country that we stand for.
All right, I want you to pass that all the way down to Metro Councilperson. Oh, he's got one. All right.
Thank you. First of all, if I could just have a quick moment to, you talked about Black history in relation to the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
If I could make a plug for what's referred to as the Simpsonville Massacre. So this is a series of, there's a beautiful marker for the men that died in this massacre in Shelby County, right along Shelbyville Road, and every Memorial Day I go out there and pay my respects. But this commemorates the massacre of members of the 5th United States Colored Cavalry near Simpsonville. And they were ambushed at the time. These were, in many cases, former slaves who were moving cattle, in this case, down that trail on behalf of the Union, and they were ambushed by Confederate soldiers, buried in a mass grave, and to large degree forgotten about for many, many years, until only a very few years ago. The state legislature, I know Representative Miller was part of this, the Historical Society, not only put up a marker, but put up appropriate military burial stones for those men in the formation that they would have been riding in, with their names and everything, the white stones in a 2x2 formation as they would have been riding on that trail. So I would encourage everybody to incorporate that into your Civil War discussion.
Excuse me, wasn't that related to the Lincoln Institute also, in that general area? The Lincoln Institute in Shelby County?
Maybe.
Okay, all right.
So as far as the redistricting is concerned, and if you don't mind, I'll probably defer to President James to talk about the larger process, but let me give you a few specifics. And I also want to acknowledge that Councilman Paula McCraney from District 7 is here joining us as well. But there are several concrete challenges that we ran into. I thought our process was good. Bluntly, if you just so you're all aware, I voted against our ultimate redistricting plan because although I thought the process was a good process, I was not in favor of the entirety of the outcome, okay? I was happy with, we did create, in the way we create the committee, it's President James, but also includes both the majority and minority caucus chairs. That's Councilman Winkler and myself, chairing and vice chairing the committee. And, the interesting dynamic, right before that, I had an economist from U of L do a preliminary census review of the movement of the population in Jefferson County over the past 20 years. And there is a mixture of news. It's not good news or bad news, it's just facts, right? And that is, as we were saying earlier, there's been a huge movement into the east end of the city. My district, District 19, is the fastest growing district in the city, bar none. I had to lose 7,000 residents when we did redistricting, so mine shrunk the most from a population point of view. And of course, as representing District 19, I'm welcome, right? I was very happy to see people coming into my district. That means that there were districts in the West End, particularly District 5, and that's Councilwoman Donna Purvis's district, that had so few people that she had to pick up 5,000 people to get back to the median. So we've seen a huge outflow of people out of the West End and a huge inflow into the East End, with the South End having sort of mixed results. That put a ton of pressure onto redistricting. There were districts that moved upwards of 50, 60% of their geography and population to keep up with that migration. And again, another fact is when we created the committee, we created a series of goals. One of the goals in relation to this conversation on Juneteenth was to maximize minority representation. If the census and the movement that we're seeing continues for the next 20 years, and even further out, I would tell you that there might be no such thing as a Metro Council district that has a majority minority population. And you can argue whether that's good or bad, but what's happening is the economic reasons, the further we're getting away from Jim Crow, the further we're getting away from redlining, the further we're getting away from institutionalized segregation, and we did that, and which was done very much here in Louisville, the more people are moving wherever they want to move. And the more you see districts like mine, which saw some of the highest or fastest increases in African American residents, and you saw districts like Councilman Ja'Cory Arthur's, who represents District 4, who saw one of the fastest increase in Caucasian residents, right? So you're seeing people moving much more in a much more egalitarian way across the city, which again, if the goal is to allow people to live wherever they want to live and give people the opportunity to live wherever they want to live, that's a good thing. But as there has been a history in redistricting to particularly not break up, and there should always continue to be this goal to not break up districts, particularly around the subject of race. The idea was at the time, there were districts that were very clearly, you could draw a circle around them and they were a majority minority population. That trend is not, well, and particularly related to one racial demographic or another, keeping in mind, and my marriage is part of this, as is President James, mind you, we're both in interracial marriages. The fastest growing marriage type in America are interracial marriages. So it's also, and what the reason this presents a problem with the census is, the census counts black-only families, white-only families, and other, meaning essentially any type of mixed racial demographic. It doesn't get into the weeds of what that means. Well, we probably need to reconsider that and maybe ask some more detailed questions about what that means. So,
Okay,
thank
thank
you.
you. All right, let's go with you, Metro Council President James, and talk about the process here in Louisville before we get to more back to the state issues.
Sure. So Councilman Piagentini said most of everything I was going to say, but I will
Okay.
add just a little bit to that.
All right.
I wanted to also recognize Jeff Noble here in the audience. Jeff, he's like a human calculator, and he helped us tremendously with our precinct numbers and population numbers, and I can tell you we probably wouldn't have gotten it done if it were not for him, so thank you, Jeff. So part of what our desire was to try to have as much input from the community as possible, but because of the delays from the U.S. Census, it put our backs against the wall. We only had, I think, 4 months? Yeah, barely 4 months to get it done, whereas we were supposed to have those numbers much earlier. And so that put our backs against the wall. So what we ended up doing was creating a WUFU form on the internet and allowed people to make public comment about what their thoughts were about redistricting. And we took a lot of that information and we ended up creating a draft document which was sent out, and a lot of people had a lot of comments about the draft. And so we took all that information and we tried to change things around, and we told Jeff, you got to make this work. And he did as best as he could. But as Councilman Piagentini was saying, to be more graphic about that, because of the loss of West Louisville and the river abutting West Louisville, the only other place to go was out. And so all the other council districts had to move because of that in order to pick up population. The rough number for each council district is roughly 30,000 people, plus or minus 5%. So that meant everybody had to move in ways that they had not really planned on ever moving. And so that caused now a lot of people have new council members. I have a good portion of my district, District Number 6, I'm introducing myself to my new constituents daily. And so I felt like the council process was a very open process. We listened to the constituent input and ideas, and we tried to work with the numbers as best we could. But I would agree with Councilman Piagentini. In the next 10 to 20 years, I think that our districts are going to look, our city is going to look much different than it does now.
Okay. So, and just so everybody understands is, when you mentioned the number, the 30,000, this is all based on numbers of people, and that's why it's so important to count all the people. And as Representative Stevenson mentioned, that is an issue if people don't respond to the census. And then, of course, COVID just upended everything in the sense of that even we at the League, we were anxious to get the numbers so we could draw our own maps, and of course, that didn't happen very early on. So we drew maps first using the old data to look at the maps, and then we got the new ones, and then we ourselves, talking about an open process, we had 9 forums all across the state to get public input from communities that were affected by the maps that we had drawn, so then we could redraw the maps, which we did. All right, let's move then to, though, let me ask one other question, but I don't want anybody to answer it yet. Keep in mind, what we all know is, though, that the Voting Rights Act, which a lot of people realize, though, too, has been gutted in some ways, and is still maybe on the chopping block, affects the way some of these districts need to be drawn in the sense of majority, minority districts, districts of communities of interest, that's really critical. And some of the criticisms for the state, and I know that Representative Bratcher knows about this from hearing from us and from the Democratic lawsuit, has to do with splitting up cities and trying not to split up even some of the obviously smaller cities. So that of course is an issue. So there has been no lawsuits filed based upon what Metro Council did. There is, and we'll get to this, there has been a lawsuit filed by the Democratic caucus of the state representatives against what was done with the House districts as well as the congressional district, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's go. Representative Bratcher, you represent, obviously, you're a state representative, represent a district. Please talk to the audience about your view of these redistricting issues and the census.
Well, I've been through 4 of these things, and they're not pleasant, and you're never going to make everybody happy. I can tell you that right away. I remember the first redistricting discussion we had. It went on for hours and hours in the House chamber, and Bill Lyle got up eventually. You know Bill Lyle. He got up and said, look, nobody outside this chamber cares what we're doing on this. They don't even understand redistricting. So let's just get this vote over with. And that kind of sums up a lot of the interest. I mean, there's people telling us there's a lot of interest there, but man, I'm wide open on Facebook, Nextdoor. You send me an email. I hardly ever hear anything about redistricting. Now, on the House maps, the state House maps, we had 4 majority-minority districts, minority-majority districts throughout the state, and 2 that are very close, and that's an all-time record for Kentucky. This plan we just passed. You know, in the court case, and we don't want to talk a lot about the court case, but there are dozens and dozens of maps. Everybody in this room could have a chance to draw the maps, and there would be everybody in this room, let's say there's 50, there would be 50 unique maps. So people get their feelings hurt on these things, but we do know, like Dee said, we do know what is required of us. One thing is the voting rights. So when you can create a minority-majority district, you should do that. That's one of the things. You're put in that direction to do that, and we did that. They gave us, the Kentucky Supreme Court gave us a certain amount of counties that we can split. For the first time that I can remember, we abided on the first try with what the Supreme Court came up. We divided the correct amount of counties. And I know this is over some people's heads, and you might drift on it, but it does get technical, and it's, to a lot of people, this is boring, but so yeah, there. So we had a session where we passed a congressional map, a House map, and a Senate map, and 2 of them are in court right now. So we don't want to get too far in the details, right, Senator? The senators' maps are not being in the court, so
All right,
they must have did it right.
Representative Bratcher, I want to ask you this question right here, though. So how and why should people be interested in redistricting? And
They
how-
should be interested
Okay.
by what has been said on this panel thus far, especially what you said, Dee, is that it matters because you need, the one person, one vote standard. Kentucky did not always follow that. I went back in some old newspapers, Courier Journal newspapers, back in the 40s, and they had some House districts that had like 17 counties in one district, and then and you come into Louisville, and it was like one small area. They did not follow that one person, one vote scenario, which means that each district should be equal. Because if you got a big district with, say, 50,000 people and one person's representing them, and then over here you have one that's, say, 5,000 population and one person's representing them, then it's just not fair. So the thing, did I answer your question?
Well, let me sort of add this. So obviously, the Constitution in Kentucky allows the legislature to draw the maps. There were no public hearings that you all held. What could you do, though, to do, as Representative Stevenson talked about, let the public, and like what Metro Council did, let the public have more input? I know you all looked at some of our maps, but there weren't any public hearings all over the state. What could the legislature do, though, to open up that process?
Well, I mean, the committee meeting was open to the public, and you can always get you can always call 564-8100 and leave a message for your legislator. Mm-hmm. Green slips. We all know about green slips.
Well, tell them about green slips. The audience might not know about green slips.
502-564-8100. You can leave your legislator a message. Don't vote for that bill, or make sure you vote for that bill, or I'm not happy with you, or I'm really happy with you. You can leave a message, and they will put those on your desk. A lot of that is email now. The old green slips are kind of fading away, but yeah, you can go to the Kentucky Legislature LRC website and find your legislator and leave a message. And I read all mine, So and I'm telling you, hand up here. If I got 3 on redistricting complaints, that was more than I can remember. There just weren't that many.
So we need to pay more attention.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right. Senator Neal, what would you say about all of this?
I don't disagree with a lot that I've heard here, but I think it's pretty obvious that there are 2 key dynamics that are important that are lacking in this process. One is transparency. Transparency is very much important. If you're not transparent, people are getting on with their daily lives. You're sent there to do things that's sometimes quite technical. But if there's not transparency, then the flag doesn't raise for to alert someone that they should engage. But the more transparency you have, the more you may gain interest and involvement. And the other side is engagement. You know, you have to be self-motivated in a democracy to engage the process. I have to agree with my colleague here just for a moment. I send out about 5,000 periodicals weekly. Those are multiplied and sent to others across in an effort to reach out as far as I possibly can. But still, I run across some folks that will say, "Where have you been?" So it's one of those things that's kind of frustrating in the sense that, you know, they don't give us the ability to reach out as much as I think that we should. But I do think that there's a responsibility from the public in a democracy to reach out, to inquire, to engage. It's not difficult, really, to connect. And I know it fights against that. There are some technical things. There are some boring things. But at the same time, all these things are going to reverberate in your life in one way or the other. So it's very important, even though it may seem indirect or you may not sense it. Now, back to transparency. You know, this is a partisan process, redistricting. There's nothing nonpartisan about it. In fact, there's nothing in today's arena that you necessarily requires bipartisanship because we have a majority-controlled House and Senate by the other party, the Republican Party. I happen to be a member of the Democratic Party. So to navigate that arena in terms of the interests of those that I represent and how I define and interpret what's important to them, I have to navigate that up there. Well, guess what? Going into that particular environment without the engagement makes it a little bit more difficult. On the other hand, let me say that in the Senate, we did it sort of right, sort of. They raised the point that we didn't join in the lawsuit from the Senate remake or redrawing of the drawing of the map. And that's because although it wasn't perfect, I must say that the leadership in the Senate did invite those in the minority party to draw their map, and let's see how that would work. And we did it without crossing county boundaries or county lines, and necessarily there's a shift because there is a shift, was a shift in population. Now, not everybody was happy with that. But at the same time, there was that input and engagement at that level. So, I can't speak to why the House undertook what it did, the way it did it, other than to say that it's not there's a lack of transparency despite the efforts, and there's a lack of adequate engagement in order to ensure it. And I applaud the League of Women Voters since 2020, I believe, have been putting bills and resolutions on the table to encourage that transparency, which I've supported loudly and sometimes vehemently. So I think it's going to be necessary in a democracy which is not perfect, which is a struggle no matter how you look at it, and I agree with my colleague, not everybody's going to be happy, but we have to work at it, and people have to be given access to it. And they have to gain and be exposed to the information necessary to respond to and to address. And it's a difficult process in a very complex and populous area, even though it may not seem that way in the state of Kentucky. So I'll leave it right there for now, and perhaps we can go further.
All right, well, just so people know, too, we have only 38 state Senate districts, and we have 100 House districts. So in that sense, the Senate had fewer lines in many ways to draw, so that might be part of it. But factually, one of the issues to understand is that goes to the transparency you're talking about, and maybe Representative Bratcher can talk about this. The House maps were put out publicly on the Thursday before the New Year's weekend. The Senate maps were not put out until Tuesday, the day the legislature began, January the 4th, and they were all voted on, and they were bills that passed by Saturday, January the 8th. So for purposes of transparency, how could we improve that process and have it more open and have public input? What could be done? And Representative Bratcher, obviously you're in the minority party in the state. Representative Stevenson and Senator Neal are in the minority party, but how could that be changed so that the public, again, knows what's happening and then has a better view of the institution? Because we know all over the country the view of Congress, the view of legislators, and maybe even Metro Council, I'll venture to say, might be pretty low as far as satisfaction. So what can be done? What could the legislature itself do? Regardless of the fact that you're not going to do this for another now 8 to 10 years, what could be done? Regardless of the green slips, what could be done?
Well, let me just give a little short, brief history lesson here of, you think of the people who wrote the Kentucky Constitution. Now, they said that they're going to go get 100 people in the House and 38 people in the Senate through elections. So you know each one of those 100 or those 38 are pretty aware people of what's going on in their communities. And the founders of the Constitution said, let's get them all together, all 138 of them, put them in the same building for 60 days and hash it all out. So my point of saying that is, first off, you have to think about that. What were they thinking, to put everybody in one building for 60 days, every day from January through April, and hash out the budget and all these bills and things like redistricting. They really wanted compromise. That's the only conclusion that you can come up with, is they wanted people to work together. So my point of saying that, Dee, is there could have been people that wanted more, say, public discourse, and then there's people that didn't, but or people that may have not wanted it. But what we got was what we got. So to answer your question, not everybody wanted, and I said this before, everybody's got would have their own way of doing things if they were just the king for a day. So there's a lot of compromise in all of this. And, other than making yourself as a state rep or a state senator available to your constituents, I have to run every 2 years. If I'm not available to my constituents, then, I have to answer for it every 2 years in an election. And I get opposed a lot. And so just be sensitive to your constituents is my answer. And that's kind of a long way around it.
Okay. Representative Stevenson, you talked about obviously the transparency issue. What do you see that the legislature actually could do to open it up so that, for example, all these people in the audience, whoever they are, have a greater say in what's going on?
We could follow a process. How is it that something that could dramatically impact our lives gets revealed on a Thursday and voted on 8 days later? Why not open it up early so people can say, this is what we like, this is what we don't like? I promise you, if we had told the people of West Louisville that you're about to lose a district, there would have been an uproar. But there wasn't enough time because it went through so quickly. We went from 3 districts in West Louisville to 2. Now, after it happened, which was too late, we got a lot of comments. But you gotta understand the lives that people are leading, which is why they sent us to Frankfurt. They've had COVID, they've had the weather, they've had kids at home, no computer access to do homework, schools closed, schools open, stuff happening, we don't know. And then you say, in the middle of that, you should learn about redistricting. Really? It's our jobs to lay out the process and say, this is where you can participate, this is how you can participate. And at the very least, the legislators should have been involved, and they were not.
All right, Metro Councilman Piagentini, so there was a little bit of an open process. I'm going to say a little bit. I don't mean to be critical so much as it wasn't a lot. of Louisville, and obviously you were affected by the census and the numbers and everything. But we're really talking in some ways about civic engagement. We're really about people being involved. So how can Metro Council keep people involved? Because now, again, it's going to be it's 2022, it's going to be, the census is not going to be to 2030, yet this really is a voting issue. Who do we send to Metro Council? Who do we send to the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, most Metro Council members, well, I can't make that claim. I know I do, I know others do, send out newsletters with some regularity. In addition, I would say, again, we represent 30,000 people each, right, give or take 5% because of the redistricting. It is really hard, if you have any exposure to your community whatsoever, to avoid bumping into somebody that, I mean, I've been in the breezeway of my church and got like accosted about development issues and road paving and all this stuff. And then finally this constituent, wonderful lady finally said, and I was trying to walk into the sanctuary to start Mass, and she finally said, oh my goodness, maybe this isn't the right time to talk to you. And I just said, it's okay, right, I'll talk to you anywhere. So I think, part of it is just creating, I do it through my newsletter, I do it through Coffee with Your Councilman, which, and look, I'm a citizen legislator, I have a day job, plus a family, plus kids, right? So I do it as often as I can. And then, but creating these forums. Now, I will say what council did, again, I'll come back to the process I complimented, right? In that we had the unique situation related to when we got the census data created a circumstance that, as President James said, we had 4 months. I would tell you operationally we only had about 2 months because there was a voting schedule that we had to hit in order to get everything done. So the amount of time we had to create a map, publish a map, get any comment on it, republish it. My understanding is 10 years ago, there was this whole road show that we did, that Metro Council did, and all of this. I would encourage us to do that again. I will say the public comment period did give us ideas on changes where we had cut neighborhoods or it was mostly minor, I wouldn't say it was major changes to the process. With that said, I will also tell you that, again, I told you I voted against it. There were a couple reasons, not the least of which is I would cite, in our case, there was a district, it's District 15. There are some council districts, and that was the one that I pointed to when I voted against it, that it's drawn in a way that I can't figure out, like there's no continuity to it. I think one of the areas, you talked about engagement, but I think one of the areas of improvement to the process would be more statutory definitions of ideas like compactness. For example, our law laid out in state statute, not so much in the Constitution dictating it, but in state statute, says that our districts must have compactness. There is no definition in state statute or anywhere that defines what compactness means. And that just means geographically, it should be as tight from the center to the edge as possible. And as a result, we have the ability to draw crazy one precinct wide, districts that cut through many different communities that don't have a lot of continuity from one end to the next, right? So I think, so as far as getting people involved, I do agree that we need to take a leadership role in getting involved. But Representative Bratcher's right. I mean, as much as I did all that, updated people, I'm the vice chair of the committee, there was very little engagement. And after the fact, I still have neighborhoods saying, you're not my representative anymore, right? As much as we put out there, it's still a huge gap. So, maybe it's something where a full year ahead of time, we have to start educating people. I don't know what the answer is to get people engaged in it, but as much as we did, it was still tough to get anybody to really be involved.
All right, speaking of compactness, I would like for you to look at the map if you can see it. It's pretty big, and I know for those who are watching on TV, they could see it. And the Senate, Representative Neal knows this, the Senate, though, drew this congressional map, okay? This is a congressional map. We have 6 representatives for our state. Now, I would ask you, what would you say to anyone who would look at that and say, where is the compactness in District 1? Just take a moment to look at it. District 1 now goes all the way from the Mississippi River in the west and the Ohio, because that's where the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, goes all the way from the Mississippi River, goes along the Tennessee border. You can see that. This is the yellow district I'm looking at. And then it goes all the way up to Frankfort, Kentucky. So I don't know if a compact definition would have helped the Senate in doing that or not, but obviously you can see why that's part of a lawsuit if you want to talk about compactness. And, one of the things that I think we have to figure out, and this affects cities as well as states, there are geographical areas and there are also cultural areas. And I know we at the League look at this and we use this map, and this is the reason I brought it, is this is a perfect example of what we would consider bad redistricting or gerrymandering. Because central Kentucky, geographically and culturally, is almost completely opposite from what's in western Kentucky. And I speak about western Kentucky because that's where all my relatives live. I never lived there except for a few years when I taught in Paducah. But they're different, but you can see what happened there with a compact. So what I'd like everybody to comment on, what about if we had, maybe even in Metro as well as the state, if we had either an advisory commission, was one of the things that the League pushed, or if we had, like some states had, we had an independent commission that would be responsible for drawing these maps as opposed to the legislature. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, can I be more specific?
You can
Can I be more
specific.
specific about
Yes.
this? What you just said, and it's something to consider. The way this thing is set up is really guided by Section 33, or should be guided by Section 33 of the Constitution. And I just want to read what it says. It says, districts were to be nearly equal in population as may be done without dividing any county, except where a county may include more than one district. Not more than 2 counties shall be joined together to form a representative district, provided in doing so, the principle requiring every district to be as nearly equal shall not be violated. No part of a county shall be added to another county to make a district, and the counties forming a district shall be contiguous. Now, this really becomes obvious when you deal with what happened in the House piece. There's no question about that. But when you look at the congressional piece, they reached all the way across all of these counties in order to reach from, as you described, from one end of Kentucky just about to the other, well, at least through the central, all the way to Jefferson. And there's just absolutely no justification or no rationalization of that process as it purports to be in compliance with the Constitution. So I think what you got here is a situation that reflects the partisanship of the process. You have someone that represents a whole different community of individuals reaching into another community of individuals, and I think arguably giving individuals incumbency and otherwise more leverage than someone else that would come into the arena. So this partisan piece is important. So I say all that to say this, that under the present circumstances and the partisan nature of the circumstances, this will continue the next time around. This is going to happen the next 10 years. No matter what happens in the census, this is going to happen. There's going to be movement unless the legislature, at the demand of people, because they're the ones ultimately going to be impacted by this, not going to have influence upon those that they know best related to their communities because of the way gerrymandering works, are not going to be able to do that unless we have a commission of some sort that advises. In fact, the piece that was put before the legislature several times has been, let's create a situation where we can engage the public, get public comment, put it in the process, and then legislature, you still retain the responsibility of making those decisions. So I think it's going to be very important going forward.
Well, and certainly, and just so the audience knows, while the Republicans were in charge of the redistricting this time around, the Democrats did some of the same things in the past. In other words, both parties have been bad actors. It's been that way in lots of different states. You might have read that the courts threw out the Democrats' redistricting in New York, and now that there's a big hullabaloo that's going on about that. And the Democrats have done some things in Illinois and Maryland, and then the Republicans have done things in Texas and Oklahoma and North Carolina. So you're right in the sense that this is a partisan issue, again, that affects all of us and gets back to what I say is what happens in Frankfurt doesn't stay in Frankfurt, and what happens in Metro Council does not stay there. So let's pay attention to that. So again, let's hear from Representative Bratcher and then Metro Council President James about what about having an advisory commission or committee or even an independent one. Some states, about 17 states, have independent commissions. What about that as a way to take some of the partisanship out of the process?
That's something that certainly should be talked about. I mean, like I said, I've been through 4 redistrictings. I know Gerald's been through more than that, probably. And this is the first time. This is the first time I've ever heard it brought up, Dee. And you guys started in 2020 paying attention to redistricting. Where were you in the 90s, in the 0-0 years,
What have I told you?
We
should have been paying attention, but we actually started in 2007 nationally. But go ahead.
I'm glad you brought up the New York thing, because there was a panel, and the legislature ignored it, right? Is that the...
Part of it.
Yeah. I mean, so it gets right back down to you got to elect people to represent you, number one, and number two, that you trust, that will do the right thing, and number two, it's in the Constitution. It started out your comments is that the legislature is responsible for redistricting. Now, if you want to change that in the Constitution, you can make a go at that. But until that changes, I don't see. And an advisory committee or a commission certainly have something to look at, and it might be a great thing.
Okay. Well,
Do you know of any examples? And maybe I don't want to get off subject now, but how many examples are there that it's worked really well?
You mean an independent commission?
Uh-huh.
Well, actually, that's one of the things that the league is going to study about for those states who have it to see how it's worked. But even though the legislature has the power to make the decision, there's nothing that would keep the legislature from opening up the process, right?
Absolutely, it should be open.
Okay.
It should be
All
open.
right. President James, what about the city? Could the city open it up even more, even though obviously it appears that it was open some in the sense of, you said you all put things out on the, and let's assume, yes, COVID affected the time frame, but going forward, and maybe even we should ask this question, how should we educate people between now and 2030 and 2031? What responsibility does our legislature or Metro Council have to continue to educate people about redistricting so that they understand this importance as a voting issue? Go ahead.
I think we should talk about it a lot more. I thought we talked about it a lot at the time, but I like everyone said, there are still people that don't know they've been redistricted. And so I would also say that, our time frame that we had to deal with this time made it very difficult to be more open than we were. When we redistricted the last time, we actually traveled around the county having town hall meetings and letting people speak. That was impossible to do this time. As far as an advisory commission, I think that's fine. I don't see anything wrong with that. I guess my hesitancy or my concern would be a better word with that is that the people that are going to be on that commission are made up of Democrats and Republicans, just like the legislature is, all right? Just like Metro Council. And so to the victor comes spoils. And so that is life.
Right. Well, I will tell you this, the advisory commission that the league sponsored, it would have had some independents and people that were not in any way affiliated with, with either party. Well, let me ask you this, and I'll start still with you here. It appears that with the data that certain groups, whites and others, were overcounted, or at least counted more correctly than minority groups who were maybe undercounted, okay? So is that something that we can correct? Was it an intentional strategy? What can we do to make sure that the very numbers that we have to deal with are okay and correct? Again, that's sort of that being, that you trust your institutions. So what can we do about that?
Well, I think that it's important that everybody needs to understand that counting is important, and that that actually answering the census mail is important, and filling out the form or getting online or however you do that. But I also think it's important that the person that's in charge, the president, thinks it's important that everybody gets counted as people.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Representative Bratcher, what can, Republicans are in control now, or if the Democrats were to change, how can you ensure that minority groups of all ilks are going to be counted and considered in the process?
Considered definitely through the Voting Rights Act, and we did do that in all of our aspects of the House. And like you said, the Senate did the Congressional Map, the House didn't. But we followed the Voting Rights Act to the T, and produced some good results for minority-majority districts. As far as the census, that's not in the states. We receive a file from the federal government, and this is what your census is in Kentucky. We don't get to go in and change any of that. I don't even know if we get to rebut it or anything. It's just there it is, use this, and that's all at the federal level. So we get it just as the public gets it too.
All right. And my question, and you can answer too, is, but what should the state and, for example, Metro Council do to make sure that, in fact, there isn't an undercount? Because we know that apparently there was an undercount of children in 2010 census that may have cost Kentucky in the hundreds of millions of dollars of the money that came from the feds. So what can we do about that?
Yeah, it is, I will say it is critically important that particularly the executive branch, but the legislative branch can help as well, has deep coordination, because essentially what happens mechanically is the federal government puts out regional offices into every state, and then even puts in sub-offices into cities and more higher populated areas. For example, in Louisville, and they have huge hiring sprees on temporary workers to do all this stuff. And it is incumbent upon the local government, whomever that is, that starts with the state, goes down to the cities, or counties, in the case of other areas across the Commonwealth, that they are coordinating with those local offices and educating them on, hey, there are pockets of underserved areas here, there are pockets of individuals here. In Louisville, for example, we have a significant, our number one non-English speaking group are Cuban immigrants, huge Cuban American population in Louisville. So it behooves us to engage with that community, right? There are smaller pockets of refugee groups from different areas around the world I've worked with Syrian refugees and other groups. And so again, the local government and or the state government and the local counties tend to know those things. They have the understanding of those dynamics. So it is incredibly important that when those field officers are created, there is a liaison, there is some sort of deep coordination between the federal, state, and local governments with those census officers to ensure that they are getting, because those are the communities that are going to be, particularly refugee communities and such who are here, are the least likely to fill this out. I mean, they have no context on the process.
Right.
So that, I think, has to be done in a very intentional way. And again, that goes from, and I'm sure, I'll say rural counties suffer from a similar problem, maybe not with refugee communities, but with folks that live off the grid, right? And don't
Right.
engage in what I'll call a more traditional process with their local governance.
Yeah. Representative Stevenson, we've got 8 years before the next census. Would it be helpful to beef up civic lessons for people? What can we do to make sure that the public keeps their eye, shall we say, on the ball and understands that this is a real voting issue, regardless of the fact that the census is not going to happen for a while?
What it's going to take is that we as officials, electeds, come up with a process, a procedure. Like, are the churches involved? Do we send a letter out to each person saying, you live here now, but this is your new district? What do we do to engage people? We're living in a right now, right here world where if the lights are not going off tomorrow, you're not going to pay attention. You tell someone that this is going to happen in 8 years, you're going to get the deer in the headlights look. So we have to be able to engage them where they are. And where they are is we need to give them the information in the way they can handle it. We need to use the institutions that are already available, the churches, the businesses, everything that's available, instead of thinking we have all the answers. We don't. And we need to sit down and talk about, if I were king or queen for a day and I had technology, imagine that. We put something on the moon, a motor, I call it a lawnmower. If we could put a lawnmower on the moon, why can't we figure out a way to get information to people in the way they can get it? That's on us. And I would like to say that's why they pay us the big bucks, but they don't.
Okay. All right, we have some questions from the audience, and let me just throw this out. Kentucky's Constitution did not account for our modern ideas of representative democracy. Obviously, women couldn't vote. Men without property couldn't vote at the beginning, and obviously, black people could not vote, slaves could not vote. How do we reconcile racial equity with modern redistricting and where we are now? How do we work that out? And what I would say is the Voting Rights Act enough? We know it's one section has been gutted, and when that happened, states just raced to pass laws to what I think even the most conservative of people would say suppress the vote. So how can we reconcile some of this? Anybody want to answer that? I can tell Senator Neal's thinking about that. What would you say?
I'm thinking about it. Are you speaking of Kentucky? Are you speaking
Yeah, let's talk about
across the
Kentucky.
board?
Well, let's talk about Kentucky. We're Kentuckians. We're here.
My observation about Kentucky this last cycle is COVID hit, and we changed the way we did that particular piece in terms of voting. We opened up the door. We expanded mail-in and that sort of thing. You didn't have to have an excuse to do that. And then COVID moderated, and we took a step back, but we didn't go all the way back from where we were pre-COVID. So I would have to give, maybe a C plus, B minus
Okay.
in that situation in Kentucky. Now, if you take Georgia, or you take Arizona, or you take some of these other places where they intentionally obviously making it more difficult for certain urban areas and students and colleges and universities to vote, and the efforts for doing that, and what if I can believe half of what I'm hearing over the air, the news media, there are people who intentionally that are out there, and I think history tells us, trying to compromise that vote so they can maintain their edge and ultimately power and set the agenda. So it's going to be a continuing process, and that goes back to the ruling of the Supreme Court on the Voting Rights Act and the need for federal congressional uprighting of that particular piece. That needs to be revisited so that we can, and not only those southern states and a few outside the states, but one that applies across the board to 50 states.
Yes?
I'd just like to add one thing about the local changes, right? And by local, I mean the Commonwealth of Kentucky changes. Look, transparently, I've fully supported what the Secretary of State has done in this realm. One of the reasons why I'm somewhat, and he did open a non-excuse early voting, right, for several days, right? Now, during COVID, it was like 30 days, right? We have to be very careful about how many days prior, because I would tell you, I don't think it's a very controversial position, and I love talking to Phil Bailey, the now USA Today, graduated from the Career Journal to the big time reporter, and he talks about this, that, for example, in the Democrat primary, during that time, you had Charles Booker running against, who was the candidate? Amy McGrath. And his campaign didn't come on until, weeks into that voting process. And there is an argument to be made that if the voting didn't start as early as it did, the outcome may have been different. Because there needs to be some level of certainty about this is the campaign cycle when candidates can get information out, and then people can make a decision. If that needle is moving too much, and it moved pretty violently in that period of time, and for good reasons, I'm not saying we should rehash the history, it happened, but there's an example of a candidate that I think has a solid argument to say they were significantly disadvantaged because of it. I'm happy to see that the state has taken on more early voting days and more non-excused absentee days, but at the same time, if you go too far, it becomes difficult, particularly I think in his case, and I think it's the candidates that have the less funded campaigns, regardless of party, regardless of state or local, who need every day they can to get their message out.
Okay, but let me ask you this, and this goes with redistricting. One of the things that the league worked on is that we, the voters, should choose our legislators. They should not choose us. And so our criticism for not having an open, transparent process is that all the legislature does is talk to themselves, among themselves, and draw the lines as opposed to talking to us. So my question to you in regards to that is, should it be more convenient for the voters or the people running for office? So anybody want to respond to that?
I'd be happy to. I don't follow the logic and the reasoning I just heard. I think it should be open. There are examples of that in the United States of America. We just characterize them as negative. There's been open voting in various states. Is it Idaho or is it one of those western states?
Well, Indiana has actually 30 days of early voting, no excuse.
Right.
And have for a long time.
Right. And my point is that it should be convenient to the voter. It should not be to those who are in incumbency in particular, because that's a very difficult thing to address in the first place. And the fact of the matter is that if you want to get down to the nuts and bolts of this thing, this is all about power, and it's all about setting the agenda. You have to have the power to set the agenda in order to promulgate the policies that are going to affect everybody's lives who are the voters. So the voters should have the convenience and the access and the ability to participate broadly, conveniently, and a lot. Let's put it that way.
Well, obviously, you can see that we could take this down 15 different rabbit holes about voting, and I will tell you that the State League is working on literally a concise as possible, because there were lots of changes that have been made since 2020 about the voting, not just the number of days, but all kinds of other things. And we're going to try to put out as concise as possible handout, as well as we'll put it on the website and try to get it to everybody. So, because I'm not sure Kentuckians understand all of these changes that have been made about voting and having the right kind of ID, and obviously the absentee ballot. I was not even sure this spring, because I thought I was going to be out of town. As it turned out, the trip was canceled. Wasn't sure whether I was even going to be able to vote because of the days I was going to be gone, and I didn't have a medical excuse for absentee ballots. So there's just a lot of those particular things. All right, we need to wind up here fairly shortly, but let's look at this, and it sort of goes with what I asked Representative Stevenson about the voters being educated about redistricting. What would each of you, for your institution, want to do if you could do it, could get the votes to do it, to make redistricting out there, that people really understand how important it is, and that it is all about voting and who we vote for? How do we educate them? What about the PR? What would you do? Each of you take just maybe 2 minutes or less to say, what would you do? What concretely, what could you do to make all of this work better, which of course also has to do with racial equity, because that's part of why we're here tonight, has to do with racial equity. Go ahead. You want to go ahead and start?
We have to look at holistically. Like, people didn't just leave West Louisville because they wanted to live in another part of town. There are little services in West Louisville. They wanted to move to communities where they could go to a sit-down restaurant, where they could go out to a movie, where they could do different things. Number two, we've got to look at the non-indicators. How many polling places are there in West Louisville? How many different things do we take away that people can't see that inhibit people from voting? Number three, there were a lot of felons that were given their rights to vote back, and no one knows how to give it back to them. What are we doing about that? So as much as we can get this process away from the politicians and back to the people, that's where we will make our money. It's human nature. If you're in charge, you want to stay in charge. So you start doing things to make sure that your power remains intact. Both parties. Give the people what they want. I think it was a song called Give the People What They Want.
I think it's about transparency and engagement. I don't think this is very complex, quite frankly, and I don't think explaining the process of redistricting is complex either. But I do think it's a matter of messaging. I think it's the vehicles that you choose, the timing of activating those vehicles, and I think that linking that message to how it impacts in everyday lives of individuals is going to make a difference. If they do not see that it's relevant, it's going to be difficult to get people motivated to engage the process. So it's going to be important for us to do that, and we have to do it aggressively. I agree with Representative Stevenson. It's the responsibility of those of us that know what the impact of what we do is on individual lives to make it happen. And to the extent it does not happen, we ought to accept responsibility for that. So I think that this question of transparency, there are different mechanisms that can be employed to do that. We should focus on that, both parties, both sides on that issue. And as it relates to the question of engagement, I think we must be insistent, persistent in that particular regard. And there's not going to be any perfection. But I think that there should not ever be anything associated with lack of effort. Thank you.
I agree with everything said. I mean, it's, one thing we can do and I know that this is probably far-fetched to say something like this, but as elected officials, we need to be good people and do the right thing. And, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm proud of every vote I've ever taken, and I couldn't live with myself if I was doing something that I didn't think was right or didn't meet, the Lord's promises. So it's just be a good person, engage, answer those questions as elected official. When they ask you, take the time, like Anthony said, take the time to talk to people, engage them, be open and straightforward, and good things can happen.
And I would agree with everything that everybody here said. I would add that, I think we can all do better at our civic engagement and the ways that we engage, whether that's through social media or e-newsletter. Councilwoman McCraney's here. She is the queen of talks and coffee with Councilwoman McCraney out in the neighborhood. So I just think as many ways as we can do better engaging people, that's what we should do. I think being as transparent as we can about the process, but still working within the limits of the law, I think is important. And that's what I have to say.
I'm going to disagree with everything. No, I'm just kidding. The thing, concrete thing I would change, I do think I'm going to come back to the definitions that I talked about related to compactness, for example. I think we would benefit all of us, and most important, by all of us I mean the public, all of the citizens, if we had clearer definitions around what are the requirements related to redistricting. And maybe we can do that in statute if it's too far a jump to get a state constitutional amendment. Because, for example, even maximizing majority-minority districts was a goal that we set forth in redistricting that is not required in state statute. And again, compactness being another example, no definition. With a definition, it would rein in and put guardrails to the elected officials that we couldn't deviate from, right? Or that somebody could sue us if we did. So I would love to see a tightening up of that, and then assuming the next census gives us the time to do it, getting back to, I think the roadshow idea is right. I don't know if I'm with President James with this. I'm not sure if an independent commission, because you're still just putting a bunch of people that have their own biases and they weren't necessarily elected, but then who appointed them and how does that work and what do they bring to the table? But the roadshow is, put out some draft maps, get in front of the people, let them beat it up. And then when you come back, hopefully you can finalize them in a way that accounted for that input process. So I like that model, and I hope we have the time to do it next go around. Thank you.
Okay. All right, to give you some summary here, as obviously we've talked about a lot of things. As I said, the League has been studying redistricting really through its national headquarters through about 2007. And I have actually told Representative Bratcher and others who've said, well, where were you when the Democrats were doing these terrible things? And I said, we should be paying attention. We should have been paying attention. And that's part of what's really hard about civic engagement, with people being put out on the street or not sure about, baby formula and all the things that are going on now and inflation. How can they pay attention to all of these things? And in some ways, I think we are civically tired from the last probably maybe even 6 or so years. And certainly with the pandemic, we're sort of tired and we don't want to pay attention, but we have to pay attention. So one of the things that the League is working on will be a constitutional amendment for an independent commission. So you say, well, they're going to be Democrats and Republicans, but one of the things that we did, and I'll toot our horn about this, when we drew our maps, we did not pay attention to legislators. We didn't pay attention to incumbents. And an independent commission could do that, draw maps that don't protect incumbents. We know, and that there's been testimony from prior people who've been involved in this process of literally going in and people saying, and we always say that it was done in the basement of the Capitol in a dark room, do you want this, do you want this precinct? Did they vote for you the last time? And one legislator, Representative Bratcher, said to us, well, we did consult people. We consulted all the legislators. Well, that's not the public. And so that's why we're still going to work for, and I think you all know we're going to do it, work for a constitutional amendment. So really what we're talking about with redistricting is, yes, it seems to be very specific. It is. It can be hard, but it doesn't have to be hard. And how do we keep ourselves involved, get other people involved? And particularly, we want to thank all of these people for coming tonight and helping us out and helping us try to understand what it's all about. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to those who are watching online. If you have further questions, you can reach out, obviously, to these people. You can reach out to the League. We have a website, the League of Women Voters of Louisville, the League of Women Voters of Kentucky. We have all kinds of redistricting information on those websites. We have voter information. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joy.